So in the last few lectures, I've talked about validity. Um, and as I've said before, validity is pretty much just a scientific kind of thing. Um, you can establish very, very precisely whether an argument is valid. There's more to do than we've looked at. There's actually, you can do this with really mathematical precision. There's so-called symbolic logic. Not going to talk about that. You can spend a whole semester on it. If you take a logic class in the philosophy department, we'll spend a lot of time on symbolic logic. But, just know that it's a way of just, with mathematical precision, seeing what are and aren't valid arguments. One thing I'll point out, people always say philosophy isn't useful. Symbolic logic is pretty much what makes computers possible. A philosopher, Bertrand Russell, did play a major role in inventing it. So the next time you hear philosophy isn't useful, just look at your computer. It might not be around, without philosophers. So, we get a lot of flack for not being useful, but, we do sometimes do some useful stuff. Anyway, that's not either here nor there. I couldn't resist. So what I do want to finish up with is to leave this concept of validity behind because, you guys didn't sign up for a logic class. I think logic's interesting, but we can't spend a whole semester on it, right? So we take a very quick pass and leave it behind. What I want to finish with is talking about good premises. If we look at an argument, a deductive argument, and we see that it's not valid, then we don't need to go any further. But if we see that it's valid, then we need to look much more closely at the premises. Are these premises true? Or at the very least, are they acceptable? Do we think they're true, right? So, good deductive argument must be valid. But it also has to have good premises. So we've talked a lot about validity because that's very precise. Whether or not the premises are good, as I said, that's a harder issue, but I do want to say a little bit about it. And we'll touch on this throughout the class. Ideally, premises should be obviously and sort of indubitably true. In the best world, in the best case, that's what we would have. Well, a lot of times things are a bit murkier, so we have to settle for a little less. But at the very least, the premises shouldn't be vulnerable to a reductio argument, right? None of your premises should set you up for an absurd conclusion elsewhere. If your argument depends on a principle that says that it's you have to let an axe murderer chop you up, or you have to tell the truth to a murderer at the door, well, whatever premise commits you to that is not a good premise. You probably need to replace it with something else if you can. Also, all your premises should at the very least be uncontroversial or adequately supported. What do I mean by that? Well, an uncontroversial premise is one that you are personally very confident it is true. You personally would assign an incredibly high probability that this is true. Maybe you don't think there's even any chance it's false. You are very confident in this premise. But uncontroversial premises go beyond that. You should also, if it's uncontroversial, you have to think that any random person would also be very confident this is true. And there might be many, many things that you believe that you know that other people, many other people, will reject. You might believe in them very, very strongly, but know that there are plenty of people, plenty of sane, decent, reasonable people who don't accept it, right? So, first, you ought to be very confident yourself that it's true, but then you ought to think that probably any random person, or at least any sane random person, would also accept it. Now, this isn't either or, and this is why this gets trickier, right? How controversial, how acceptable a premise is exists on a spectrum, right? More or less. But you want the least controversial premises you can find. So here's an example. Less controversial. Abraham Lincoln was a good president, right? Now look, there might be some people who object to this. There's going to be, goodness, somebody even listening to this might not like it. But, you know, most people will accept this, right? Average person on the street, average random person from your class, was Lincoln a good president? Will probably say yes, right? Now look, there might be some crazy person who rejects anything you throw out, right? You know, I was talking about Gandhi in one of my classes being an admirable person, and one of my students just absolutely hated Gandhi. Not just like Gandhi's overrated, but was banging the table how much they hated Gandhi, how terrible he was, right? Nonetheless, I think the idea that Gandhi was a pretty good person is uncontroversial, right? You might find some crazy person if you say, well, we all know the earth is round, they might be a flat earther. Nonetheless, it's pretty darn uncontroversial. The earth is in fact round, even if some weirdo might argue with you about it, right? Nonetheless, Lincoln, good president, earth round, Gandhi, pretty good guy, all uncontroversial premises, right? More controversial, Ulysses S. Grant was a good president, right? You might think he is, you might think he's not. I tend to think he was. I tend to think Grant was underrated, but I know that a lot of people will disagree on that, right? That's a more controversial claim. Even more controversial, whether you like, Donald Trump or not, you might hate him, you might love him, you might be somewhere in between, but hopefully you can see, even if you like Donald Trump, think he was a good president, that's way more controversial, right? Way more likely that someone will object to that than Abraham Lincoln was a good president, right? Or you can plug in Obama here or whoever, Clinton, Reagan, anybody. It's going to be more controversial than that Lincoln was a good president. Use the least controversial premises you can to establish your conclusion. Well, why is that, right? Well, especially if you are trying to convince other people, and that's one of the main things we use an argument for, is to try to convince others. If you use a premise that they just don't buy, your argument's not going to work. If you say, well, we all know X, therefore Y, and they say, nope, X is crazy, well, you can have a valid argument, but if they just completely reject your premises, you are going to get nowhere, right? Use the least controversial premises that will establish your conclusion. Here's an example of how this works, right? This is actually from an assignment in another one of my classes, and this is a sort of mistake people often make. One of our assignments, we talk about at the end of after the Vietnam War, Jimmy Carter gave an amnesty to people who avoided the draft in Vietnam. A lot of them had fled to Canada. They couldn't come back because they'd be charged. Carter gave an amnesty, and I asked students whether they support this or not, right? And a lot of times people use this premise. No one should be punished for refusing to fight in a war they don't believe in. So people who avoided the draft in the Vietnam War, they didn't believe in the war, so they shouldn't be punished, right? But think about how controversial this premise is, right? Lots of people, especially if you think these people shouldn't have been pardoned, you are not likely to believe that if you don't want to fight in a war, you shouldn't be punished for refusing to, right? That's a pretty controversial premise. Not just is it controversial, but you can think of reductio arguments, right? If we should really never punish anyone for refusing to fight in a war they don't believe in, well, then people who were Nazi sympathizers in the US and Britain shouldn't have been made to fight in World War II, or they shouldn't have been punished for not doing it. That seems crazy that you can get out of defending your country because you're a terrible person who likes the Nazis, right? So, controversial premise, also open to these reductio arguments. You shouldn't use a premise like this, right? Much better premise. No one should be punished for refusing to fight in a war that won't achieve its aims. If a war is pointless, if the war is not going to succeed, if you're asking people to die for something that's not going to be achieved, you're not going to achieve your goals, that's way more acceptable, right? Even people who think, well, yes, sometimes people should be forced to defend their country even if they might disagree. Well, if the war is pointless, if it's not going to achieve its aims, many of them would accept that, right? It's also not open to this sort of reductio that we'd have to let Nazi sympathizers off the hook in World War II, right? This is a much better premise than the premise in this first argument. No one should be punished for refusing to fight in a war that won't achieve its aims. The Vietnam War didn't achieve its aims, so those who avoided the draft during the war shouldn't be punished. Agree with the argument, disagree with it, that's not my point. My point is just to show first argument is a lot weaker argument than the second because the first one uses a much more controversial premise. Many people who will reject the key premise in 1 will accept the premise in 2, and the premise in 2 is not as easily open to these reductio arguments. General rule, you can use controversial premises in an argument, but you have to offer either an argument for them or you have to give evidence, right? Look, if we're talking about the death penalty and you say, well, we all know the death penalty doesn't work, especially if we were doing that as a discussion post in this class, you couldn't get away with that, right? Lots of people do think the death penalty works. So if you're going to say that, you need to give an argument or some evidence that the death penalty really doesn't work, right? If you go and you find a reputable source online that says, well, here's all this evidence that shows or suggests the death penalty doesn't prevent murder, then you've given yourself some right to that controversial premise. You have some evidence, right? But you can't just throw it out there. Finally, premises must be less controversial than the conclusion. Why is that? Well, remember, especially if you're trying to convince another person, you need to give them premises they accept to get them to accept a conclusion they either don't accept or might not. Well, If your premise is something they find way more objectionable, way less plausible, way more controversial than the conclusion, it's just not going to work. So, always try to have premises that are less controversial, more likely the other person will accept than the conclusion. Your premises are your foundation, right? If they're actually weaker than the thing you try to put on top of them, of course it's going to fall down, right? Of course you've got the order wrong. So that's really all I want to say about basic argument for now. And I know we've done a lot. And I don't expect you guys to perfectly grasp everything here. We have a worksheet on this. We'll go through it. I think that'll maybe help you guys with this. Hopefully it will. But you don't have to have all of this stuff completely down. I just want to just want to introduce it. So it's not completely alien, so you're familiar with it when we start to use some of these ideas to look at the arguments that the philosophers we're going to talk about make, and the arguments we're going to make in thinking about some of the issues that are raised by these philosophers. So, a lot of this is, I don't know. I think back to a swim class I took way back when I was a kid, right? Our teacher said, you always have to get your hair wet before you leave. Just trying to get us all as children past this sort of fear we have getting your head underwater, right? So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Hopefully you don't feel like I just threw you in the deep end. That is not my intention. If you are a little shaky on some of this stuff, don't worry. Just as long as you have the basic concepts, I just want those to be in place for when we, use this stuff in the future. And we will use it in the future, so hopefully that will, if you are a little shaky, firm that up for you.